From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wade's Movie World. This is a special video, which I'm going to have a few special videos of this weekend in honor of the 20th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks that took place in New York City, New York, Washington, D.C., and in a rural area in Pennsylvania. This video is dedicated to all who lost their lives that day. A few months ago, back in late November of 2020 or early December 2020, and now here again this past Sunday and Monday, I went back and I watched ABC News coverage of the events of September 11th, 2001, the terror attacks that occurred. They occurred on the Twin World Trade Towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and on board the plane United Flight 93, which crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania. That plane's target was supposed to be either the Capitol building or the White House. I'm not sure which, or if that has ever been confirmed, but that's what I've read through a lot of reports and research that I've done on the 9/11 terror attacks. If someone out there watching my videos knows the exact answer to that question, which target United 93 was headed for, please be so kind and to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Thank you very much. That day, when I was watching the coverage of the events at home, we mainly watched the CBS coverage and the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, because the main local news we watched on that channel was KTAB News in Abilene, Texas, where we were living at the time. KTAB was the local CBS affiliate. They would break into the national coverage ever so often to cover events and how it was affecting the people and everything locally that day. I never really was a big fan of Dan Rather as an anchor of the CBS Evening News. He was a better reporter than he was an anchor. So here recently, I decided, since we are getting close to the 20th anniversary, I decided to go back and watch coverage of the events from that day from the perspective of the ABC News anchors and reporters. I even went back and watched some coverage of NBC News, but out of the big three that day, Peter Jennings, the longtime solo anchor of ABC's World News Tonight and ABC News reporters and journalists, I believe did the best coverage that day, and I believe they were the most professional out of all of them. All of us growing up in probably the 70s and 80s, we knew who Peter Jennings was, and we knew that he was a veteran news anchor and had tons of experience and practice, and his presence and voice, to me, was more reassuring on that day than Dan Rather's or Tom Brokaw's. We all know and remember that most of the day's events occurred during the morning hours, and during that time, the morning shows were on, such as the CBS Morning News, NBC's Today, and ABC's Good Morning America. So when I was rewatching the coverage a few months ago and this week, the coverage started out like any other normal day. The morning news was on. It was Good Morning America with Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer doing their regular thing until just right after 8:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. They came back after a commercial break, and the first plane had just struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and their attention from the regular set morning schedule switched immediately to the events of what was happening in Lower Manhattan. Both Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer were talking about what was happening on the phone with ABC's Don Daler, who at the time was a producer for ABC News and Good Morning America, when the second plane came in and struck the second tower, the South Tower of the World Trade Center, sending the city, the nation, and the world into shock and chaos, causing everyone's thinking to shift from a possible accident to now a deliberate attack on the World Trade Center and on the United States of America. Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer were both on the phone on air with Don Daler when that happened, and directly afterwards they started speaking on the phone to bystanders and witnesses and even people directly involved in the events taking place. After about a few minutes of watching the events and talking with witnesses, the network switched over from the Good Morning America's set with Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer to the ABC News studios uptown to the World News headquarters, where Peter Jennings took over the rest of the day and even some into the night until the early morning hours of the next day, Wednesday, September 12th, when ABC's Nightline anchor Edd Kalehoff took over for a little while. Peter Jennings, along with many reporters who were deployed out in to the field to cover the events of that day despite all the chaos, remained calm and very, very professional during the events while talking and interviewing people who were a part of the events, who were witnesses, from professionals such as New York City officials, Pentagon officials, workers at the Pentagon, police officers, firefighters, politicians, FBI agents, terrorism experts, airline officials, and officials from the FAA, as well as people who were coming out of the towers and, trying to escape. Peter Jennings did a very good job, along with his colleagues, giving Americans watching and others around the world peace of mind during the very frightening and scary events. His words and demeanor were calm. He did get a little irritated at one point because he had two different television monitors in front of him showing him two different things, and he asked people on the floor working the cameras to fix the correct monitor in front of him so he knew which one was correct so he could talk about the correct things going on. Apparently they didn't do that right away because he had to interrupt his coverage to get someone to do that now, and he even said to them, "May I not have to ask again a third time?" Yeah, during that sort of thing, that would be a little irritating. I would probably get irritated myself. When that did happen, you did hear the agitation in his voice. But like I said, who could blame him, because at that particular moment in time, he had a job to do, and a very important one, and it had to be done correctly. As a veteran professional journalist, he knew that, and that was the reason he was irritated at that particular moment of the day. He did get emotional one time, and he told his audience watching that it was because during a commercial break, he called his family, his wife and kids, to check on them and tell them he loved them. And you could see the emotion on his face as he told the audience that is what he was doing during that particular commercial break, and urged others, if they could get through on an overloaded phone grid, to call their loved ones up and check on them and tell them they loved them.
We do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply stressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting on it.
We never did see an emotional side of Peter Jennings all that often, but that was one that really took heart, and you could see the emotion on his face. And I'm sure there was all sorts of emotions floating around out there on that particular day. As far as the side of the planes being hijacked, that information came in slow, and he and his colleagues really didn't start talking about that until much later. Also, the mention of Osama bin Laden didn't start happening until after both towers had already collapsed. Something interesting one of the reporters mentioned to Peter was that, of course, at that particular time, they did not know if and when President George W. Bush was flying back to Washington, D.C., but that the White House officials and officials at Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One always takes off and lands, had barred news crews from the base, as the base was, of course, on lockdown and had heightened security measures in place, and the threat level status raised because of the attacks. During the coverage, Peter talked to by phone with John McWethy, who reported from the Pentagon, and was able to confirm to Peter and the ABC News audience that a jetliner plane did in fact slam and crash into the Pentagon. As they are talking about the attack on the Pentagon is when talk of groups of terrorists in the Middle East and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, plus the intelligence failure which occurred through the intelligence community, began. They both talked about the different intelligence organizations which failed to do their jobs and also failed to share information with each other to be able to keep something like this from happening, which everyone knew right now was totally on them. Later on during the coverage, during the 10 o'clock a.m. hour, ABC News received a statement from American Airlines which Peter read over the air, talking about the two planes that were now confirmed hijacked. American Airlines Flight 11, which was flown into the World Trade Center, though at that particular time no one was sure if it was the first plane or the second plane. Then Peter read out to the public that American Airlines Flight 77, which was also confirmed a hijacked plane, but no one could confirm if that plane was flown into the World Trade Center or if that one went into the Pentagon. Peter talked by phone to aviation reporter Lisa Stark, who at the time was in Seattle, Washington, and she told Peter and the audience that officials at the United Airlines organization told her about a crashed United Airlines Flight 93 in rural Pennsylvania, and at the time nothing was known about that flight except that it left Newark Airport in New Jersey en route to San Francisco, California. She also told Peter that They told her about another flight they were concerned about because it was nowhere to be found on anyone's scopes or radars, which was United Flight 175, which of course we all know now that was the second plane to hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center. But at that time, they had no idea about that. And according to United Airlines at the time, it was just labeled as missing. One thing is when the two planes hit the World Trade Center Twin Towers, you didn't get to see or hear Peter Jennings' reaction because Good Morning America was still going. We didn't see Charlie Gibson or Diane Sawyer's reaction to the second plane being flown into the South Tower, but we definitely heard it, as well as other people in the studio with them. When I went back and rewatched that, I felt like you could just hear the air being sucked out of Diane Sawyer when it happened. You could hear the horror and sadness in her voice. Charlie Gibson, I think, was probably in shock and horrified just like everybody else, but I think he was trying to remain as professional as possible, though his voice did change after the fact, and you could hear the fear in his voice as he was reporting, and he said to the audience that this was just awful and very terrifying. After the network switched over to the World News headquarters with Peter Jennings at the news desk, the airplanes had already hit the two Twin Towers as of that time and were still standing, and the Pentagon had not yet been hit. Peter was talking about what the city of New York was doing and their procedures going forward and what the city's emergency response was at this point in time. ABC's John Miller told Peter that the city is going into an Archangel operation, which he said was a code name for a major lockdown of the entire city and the island of Manhattan. Both Peter and John, as well as others in the ABC World News headquarters studios, did witness both towers disintegrate and collapse to the ground. Peter was able to keep it together and keep himself composed, but you could clearly hear a change in his voice from professional news anchor to a tone of essentially horror and heartbreak as he and all of his colleagues watched in complete shock as both towers came down. Peter mentioned as the towers were coming down and the huge cloud of dust and debris emerged from the site and funneled its way through the buildings, that now they were looking at a significant loss of life, and that number of casualties would be in the thousands or possibly higher. Peter Jennings and his colleagues continued to report on the events that had already transpired, and just like everyone else in the world, wondering if this was it or if more was to come. On that day, we mainly watched Dan Rather's coverage of the events on CBS, but we did flip it over to Peter Jennings quite a bit throughout the day. But we would always go back to CBS and Dan Rather, and that was just because CBS was the local news channel we watched in our house on a regular basis. But as a child growing up, we would always watch ABC's Good Morning America and ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings a lot as I was growing up, but I was in high school then. And the news channel that we watched when we were living in Abilene was KTAB News CBS, and so that's mainly why we had it on Dan Rather that day. I did find full news coverage of the events covered by NBC News on YouTube, starting with NBC's morning show called Today, which was with Matt Lauer, Katie Couric, Al Roker, and Ann Curry were all there anchoring. I did like their coverage that they did, especially Katie Couric, who I've always been a fan of. But as soon as they switched over their network to the nightly news anchor Tom Brokaw, I didn't watch any more of the NBC coverage. I've just never been a big fan of Tom Brokaw. I really liked at the time ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings because I felt like Peter was very professional and he had an integrity. He delivered the unbiased truth in the news. He was personable and inviting, and he was a very well-liked journalist who was very good at his job, and you liked having him come visit you during the evening hours of your day during the week. Plus, growing up when my dad wasn't traveling, he would always usually watch ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. And just like a lot of Americans and people in the United States and around the world, that's how we, and I and my family, got to know Peter Jennings. It was a sad day in TV news journalism broadcasts when he stepped away due to his declining health, but it was even sadder the day he died. Peter Jennings will always be a legendary TV news broadcast journalist and legend. It's not the legend of Ron Burgundy, instead it's the legend of Peter Jennings. I'm just glad Peter Jennings is not around today to see where TV news broadcast journalism has gone in the United States. The only people to ever anchor the evening news shows that almost make it up to Peter Jennings' level were people like Charlie Gibson. He anchored ABC's World News Tonight after Peter. And then Katie Couric, who left NBC's Today, who went on to anchor the CBS Evening News. And then Scott Pelley was after her anchoring the CBS Evening News. And then we had on ABC World News with Diane Sawyer. I can sometimes watch ABC World News Tonight with David Muir, and same with the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell. Other than this handful of people, no one else comes close. Peter Jennings is anchoring and coverage that day amid the terrorism and chaos, and the horror was absolutely top-notch, and I don't think could have ever been topped by anyone. Well, like I said at the beginning of this video, he was reassuring, and it was just, his voice was calm, and you know, amidst all the chaos, that's what we needed at that particular moment, was calm. Peter Jennings is one of the reasons I wanted to possibly try and get into television news broadcasting as an adult, which I eventually did for a few years, but then I became a teacher. But actually, with the way things are going in the TV news business, I would like to get back into it and turn things around and make journalism better and more reliable than what it is now. If I do get back into TV news journalism, I want to do it like Peter, by having integrity, by telling the unbiased truth, and by being inviting to my viewers. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Mr. Peter Jennings for being a voice of calm and helping a lot of us put our minds at ease on such a horrific day. You are missed down here on earth, but I know you're much happier up there in heaven. Rest in peace, Mr. Jennings, and when I die, if the good Lord grants me access into heaven through the pearly gates, I hope to meet you up there and just carry on a cool conversation with you, news related or not news related. So thank you, Mr. Peter Jennings. Rest in peace. So I know this was more about Peter Jennings than it was about 9/11, but I felt like Peter Jennings was a huge part in that day, and one of the good parts, the reassuring parts, the calm parts, just someone to help us wrap our heads around what was happening that day. So this video is a tribute to the victims of 9/11 and their families, and also to Peter Jennings himself. To everyone else out there who's watching this video, I would like for you to join me in just a quick moment of silence as we remember and reflect on the lives lost that day and the 20th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you very much. We will always remember Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. May God bless us all, and may God bless the United States of America.
And now to Peter Jennings. Anybody who knows him will tell you he is not only an extraordinary journalist, but incredibly tough.
Finally, this evening, a brief note about change. Some of you have noticed in the last several days that I was not covering the Pope. While my colleagues at ABC did a superb job, I did think a few times I was missing out. However, as some of you now know, I have learned in the last couple of days that I have lung cancer. Yes, I was a smoker until about 20 years ago, and I was weak, and I smoked over 9/11. But whatever the reason, the news does slow you down a bit. I've been reminding my colleagues today, who've all been incredibly supportive, that almost 10 million Americans are already living with cancer, and I have a lot to learn from them. And living is the key word. The National Cancer Institute says that we are survivors from the moment of diagnosis. I will continue to do the broadcast. On good days, my voice will not always be like this. Certainly, it's been a long time, and I hope it goes without saying that a journalist who doesn't value deeply the audience's loyalty should be in another line of work. To be perfectly honest, I'm a little surprised at the kindness today from so many people. That's not intended as false modesty, but even I was taken aback by how far and how fast news travels. Finally, I wonder if other men and women ask their doctors right away, "Okay, doc, when does the hair go?" At any rate, that's it for now in World News Tonight. Have a good evening. I'm Peter Jennings. Thanks and good night.